Welcome to this narrated PowerPoint on lesson planning. In this particular presentation, I'll be laying out a step-by-step approach that you can use to plan most lessons. As you view this presentation, it will be extremely helpful to take notes on the organizer that was provided in class. Additionally, I suggest that you keep your big book handy so that you can make reference to various documents that I'll allude to. If the content begins to feel a little bit overwhelming, feel free to give yourself a break and view this presentation in 2 sittings. You may also wish to view this presentation a second time to pick up on any lesson planning nuances that you may have missed the first time. In our next class session, when we're face-to-face, you'll be using the knowledge gained through this PowerPoint to construct an original lesson. During the course of the semester, you will independently build 2 additional lessons based on the model that you're about to encounter. At times, the Madeline Hunter lesson design model is known as the elements of instruction, the gradual release model, or the direct instruction model. In the future, when you fill out applications for teaching positions, you may be asked to describe how familiar you are with the elements of instruction. You should be able to say with confidence that you've studied it thoroughly and that you've practiced it extensively. Before we advance to the next slide, let me make a few comments about Dr. Madeline Hunter, the originator of this lesson design. First, she was one of the most influential educators in the 20th century. She was based out of UCLA and literally spoke in every state in the United States and dozens of countries on a worldwide basis. Interestingly, none of her research was completely original. She took the great ideas of others and put them in a new package, a lesson design model that hadn't been encountered before. During your Block 2 experience, you'll encounter other lesson design models. Each of these are of equal or greater value to the Hunter design. Please be open to learning the most you possibly can about each model. If I'm not mistaken, however, you'll see influences of Hunter's work in almost all instructional design models that you encounter at Bethel or in your future school setting. We're going to begin by taking a quick look at all parts of the lesson design model that you'll be working with. Most parts are Hunter-based, but the first 6 sections are additions that we as your Block 2 instructors felt were critical to add. That said, let's do a quick overview and then we'll look at each element in detail. The first thing you'll establish are your essential questions, or your big ideas. Next, you'll include a general instructional objective, and then you'll include your specific learning outcome or outcomes. Next, you'll identify the academic language that you'll focus on. Then you'll include a listing of the materials necessary for the lesson. And then you'll talk exactly about how your specific learning outcomes will be assessed. Then you'll move into the parts that Hunter is most famous for: the anticipatory set, the meaning and purpose section, and then a part of the lesson that includes 3 components: the teacher instruction, modeling, and active participation. Next, you'll include the guided practice, independent practice, and closure. The final portion of your lesson will be differentiation. All of these parts are found in the lesson plan form in your big book, and I created a lesson plan template that's found on the course Moodle site that you can use as you build your lessons. Let's look now in more detail at each part. The essential questions, called EQs at times, are a limited number of questions, maybe 1 to 3, that your lesson will answer by the conclusion. The key to writing good EQs is that you write these in a way that students would actually care about them. In other words, use student-friendly language and make the questions interesting. The general instructional objective. You'll have 1 of these for a given lesson. This should be written following the guidelines discussed earlier when we examined objective writing. And the specific learning outcomes. You'll have 1 to 3 of these per lesson. Generally speaking, it works better to have 1 or 2 of these, and then your lesson has clear focus. When writing these, remember to start them with 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, if you have that many, and start them with a verb from the far right-hand column of the objective writing sheet for SLOs. For academic language, you need to do 2 things. First, list the specific words that are essential for understanding the content you'll teach. Second, describe briefly how you will pre-teach each of those individual words. For materials needed, you will list all the individual materials that you or the students would need. This might include worksheets, specific children's books, items that you show as part of the lesson, etc. You may wish to do this part of the lesson plan after you've written the full lesson. You'll find this listing is very helpful because it allows you to double check to be sure that you have all necessary materials before you start teaching the lesson. In terms of assessment, let's work through the questions that you see on the screen. First, anything that you have listed for your SLO is what you should assess. Second, assessment should occur throughout your lesson. It's very likely that you'll have 2 to 3 actual assessment points in your lesson. And third, the best way we found to conduct assessment is to actually list the SLOs by number and then write all the specific evidence that you will look or listen for to know if students have accomplished each SLO. If you advance to the next slide, you'll see what 2 SLOs might look like and how you could write the assessment section of your plan. On the top of the slide, you'll see the SLOs for the sample lesson in your big book. For the assessment part, you'll see how 1.1 and 1.2 were listed, and then specific evidence that can be examined was listed. According to a backward design model, you actually begin your formal lesson plan like this, by clearly stating what the objectives are and how they will be assessed. These assessment points can be built right into the lesson that you'll design in the next steps. Now, let's advance the slide and you'll see the first of Madeline Hunter's elements of instruction. I'll work through each question related to the anticipatory set. The anticipatory set is a period of about 2 to 5 minutes that is designed to draw students into your lesson. In a sense, it's an attention-grabbing device. There are 3 critical components to a good set. First, it must be relevant to your objectives. Second, your students need to be able to relate to what you're presenting. And third, it should actively involve your students in that there should be something they look at, listen to, or do. The anticipatory set helps students learn because a spread of activation is occurring when you present a well-designed anticipatory set. If I were teaching a lesson about Mexico, for example, and I started asking questions about who had traveled there, where they went, what they saw or did, etc., that's activating the neural networks in the brain that contain this information about Mexico. Once this spread of activation occurs, it's much easier to start adding new information and building this schemata. The obvious answer to when you should use an anticipatory set would be to say at the start of the lesson. While this is certainly true, you might want to improvise an anticipatory set if your students become distracted during your lesson. For example, if you had a fire drill, your students would likely return to your classroom wondering if there was a fire, who was talking during the drill, etc., versus what you were actually teaching about. On the next slide, I'm going to show you my favorite styles of anticipatory sets. Options for you to consider are personal story, a question or questions, a problem situation you pose. You might show an object related to your lesson, might have them do something, perhaps you read something aloud, you might have them listen or view a media piece, or you might have them watch you do something. It's important that you rely on a variety of an anticipatory set tools and not just rely on one type. Push yourself to develop as a teacher who has many attention-grabbing devices. But do keep in mind that this is an important part of your lesson, but the other parts should be equally interesting. When we talk about giving meaning and purpose, we mean letting the students know what the SLOs are in language they can understand, and helping them to see how mastering these outcomes will really be useful in their lives. Research has shown that when students understand why they're learning something, whether it's specific content or a process, two good things happen. First, the rate or speed of learning increases. And second, the degree or depth of learning increases. In terms of the when and how, it's good to build meaning and purpose at the start of the lesson, but it's sometimes helpful to revisit this at the end of the lesson. For example, you might have just taught your students how to properly address an envelope. It would be good at the end of this lesson to just ask them, now, when could you use this great skill you just learned? For the how part of this question, I'm going to suggest three approaches for you to consider. Let's look at the next slide. The first method works well only if it's obvious how the information could be used. If I taught a lesson about telling time, I might ask them, now, how could you use this information we're learning about telling time? If it's not really obvious how to use the skill, I might give a personal example, being very specific about how I've used this particular information. I like this approach because they get connected to you personally and they see that a real person uses this information. Another option is to just tell them how the skill is used. This approach is my least favorite, but it can work. Generally speaking, when you combine 2 or 3 of the approaches, you'll do an even better job of selling your objectives. Let's look at the next element. Information is meaningful when several things happen. First, it needs to be reasonably well organized. It needs to be presented in language students understand. This is where being aware of academic vocabulary is so important. The presentation material needs to accommodate various learning styles, and the students need to have sufficient background knowledge to understand the new content you're presenting. When we make information meaningful, students learn better. Now, let's look at how to make the information meaningful. Generally speaking, what you want to do is develop your information by using questions and doing as little telling, lecturing, as possible. This part is the bulk of your lesson. It may last 7 or 8 up to 15 minutes. Remember, try to pull the information out of them versus telling. Another way of thinking about modeling is to think of it as show and tell by the teacher. Modeling can be used anytime there is a process or product, and the demonstration you give needs to be as perfect as possible. This will give the mind a correct first image and avoids the confusion of learning something wrong the first time. In modeling, you're demonstrating the skill while talking about the criteria that makes the demonstration perfect. For example, if I was teaching how to shoot a basketball, I would first show how I position my feet where my right foot is forward, my left foot is backwards. If I'm right-handed, I'd have a bend in my knees, and then I'm going to keep my elbow in by my side as I'm making the shot, and then I'm going to complete my shot with my hand making the shape of a gooseneck. So all the time I would be showing and talking at the same time. Modeling helps students to learn because it combines the visual and the auditory input. It also makes the learning more concrete and easier to understand. Modeling is effective for pre-K through adult learners. It helps all of us to see something modeled. Models are best used when you have a process or a product that you want students to learn. Let's look at the next slide to see how models are developed. First, you'll determine the critical criteria of the particular skill you're teaching. Next, you're going to plan how to show that process or product. And then third, you're going to plan the explanation that will go along with the time that you're showing. Let me provide an example. Let's say I was doing a handwriting lesson making upper and lowercase t's and f's. I'd first think about what they're most likely to have trouble with. Next, I'd think about how I was going to show that on the whiteboard or on the smartboard. Next, I'd think about what I want to say as I was modeling the upper and the lowercase t's and f's. Let's look at active participation now. Active participation means having your learners fully engaged. You might have them thinking, writing, reading, speaking, listening, looking. It's critical to have active participation whenever you want deep and meaningful learning to occur. For active participation, I suggest that you combine it with the teacher instruction and modeling sections. It's hard to separate these three sections. At this point now, I'd like you to look at the sample lesson plan found in your big book. I'd like you to read it through until the teacher instruction, modeling, and active participation sections. Beginning with the anticipatory set portion of the lesson, you'll notice that everything is written in what's called dialogue style. When writing in this style, imagine that your students are sitting right in front of you and that you're actually addressing them directly. Write exactly as you would speak to them. Take a break now and look at the first half of the sample lesson plan. When we talk about guided practice, we mean having the students practice the smallest amount of a task that will still have meaning. The goal at this point in the lesson is that the teacher is doing less and less of the work and the students are doing more of it. The practice time should be short and intense and highly motivating. This is the student's first real attempt at trying the process or product that you've been modeling. One of the most critical aspects of guided practice is that you need to give immediate and specific feedback. Students learn through guided practice because they're more deeply engaged in the learning process. It is no longer the teacher doing the work, it's actually them. It turns out that this form of practice increases retention, and success with the task brings increased student motivation. Guided practice is most effective right after the teacher instruction, modeling, and active participation section of your plan. Let me provide a verbal description about how I do guided practice with a handwriting lesson I mentioned earlier. After I've modeled the correct formation of the upper and lowercase t's and f's, I would have the students do a line of each. While they practice, I'd walk around and look at the student work that's happening. If a student's doing particularly well, I might point out the aspect of that uppercase or lowercase t or f that they've done a particularly great job on. If they're having trouble in a certain aspect of forming the letter, I might take my pen or pencil and on their paper model for them what it should look like. I'd then give them a chance to try it, make a comment on it, and then move on to take a look at the work of the next student. During this time, I'd be circulating throughout the room, giving individual feedback to each student on how they're doing with the T's and F's. Now, you're probably wondering why I have a cement truck on the screen. This is to represent the new learning that will take place with your students. When your learners attempt something new for the first time, it's like wet cement. You need to work with it and correct it right when it's poured. If it sets too long without correction, it hardens, and it's almost impossible to work with. Independent practice is best used when you've seen that students can be successful with the new process or product that you've introduced them to. Guided practice is your first real chance to examine evidence of their success at whatever you introduced. If you're not satisfied with their level of performance in guided practice, consider some brief reteaching and practice before they begin the independent practice. Independent practice can take several forms. It could be a worksheet, a page from a book, a project, a quiz, etc. But it should be as real life as possible and look very similar to what they did in guided practice. Your students won't have success with independent practice if the task looks much different from what they did in guided practice. You'll wind up with confused students and many questions. The amount of independent practice depends on how much repetition is necessary for learning to really sink in. If the new learning is fairly simple, then less independent practice is necessary than if you had a more complex task for your students. On a real practical note, I suggest that you get students started on independent practice when you're present in the room. There's nothing more frustrating for a student or a parent than trying to deal with a homework task that the child isn't familiar with. The independent practice and the guided practice are both perfect forms of evidence when you're trying to decide if the SLOs were realized for your lesson. Closure is the final element of the Hunter design. When we talk about closure, we're really talking about review. The key thing, however, is that the review needs to come from the students versus you as the teacher. The closure should relate directly to the SLOs, and it can take multiple forms. For example, you might have students talk or write about the 2 or 3 most important things they learned in the lesson. It's important that every student engage in the closure, and it need not take more than a few minutes. Closure is helpful for students for several reasons. First, it helps them focus on the key content of the lesson. Second, the repetition helps the learning sink in. And third, hearing the new learning shared by a peer is yet another source of meaningful input. Closure is best right at the end of the lesson. Even if the students will do some independent practice or homework, you can still finish your lesson with closure. Based on watching hundreds of lessons, I've noticed that it's easy to forget closure. You'll have to watch the clock very closely to get it in. If there just isn't time for the closure at the end of a given lesson, you may consider starting a new but related lesson with closure. As with everything in teaching, you'll want to develop several methods of conducting closure. When we refer to differentiation, we're talking about modifications or accommodations for students based on content, process, product, and environment. Differentiation can make a significant difference in how much certain students are able to learn. As an instructor, you'll need to make decisions about who you will differentiate for. The obvious choices are your English learners, children with exceptionalities, and struggling students, but I encourage you to consider all students in your class when making these decisions. Differentiation works best when you as a teacher are intentional about it. This is best done by identifying specific students or groups of students that you may differentiate for based on content, process, product, or the environment. In terms of your actual plan, you may wish to write up this section as you plan the other portions of the lesson. Some teachers, however, like to consider differentiation once the other portions of the plan are completed. At this point, we've worked through all the elements of instruction suggested by Hunter. You've already looked at the sample lesson plan for the first 3 elements. Now I'd like you to review the sample plan and consider how the guided practice, independent practice, and closure were handled with the dialogue style. I'd also like you to look at the Big Book document called the Individual Lesson Plan Checklist. This will serve as a great tool for you. As mentioned before, in our next face-to-face class, we'll begin to build a lesson together. Bring your notes, and then you will build 2 lessons independently. Extensive feedback will be provided between and after your 2 lesson plans. The work you do with lesson planning is at the heart and soul of what teachers do, and I hope this presentation got you off to a good start in planning your future lessons. Thanks for joining me.